So welcome, thanks for coming. It's also my first time in Bratislava. I've been in Slovakia before a couple of times. I've worked with people in the country. Ernie is here, one of them actually. In my, I've done independent games development for 20 years almost. I started a studio called Data Realms, and we've made 2 games in 20 years. So. Whether that's a smart business move or not, that is debatable, but I am proud of the fact that we built our own technology for both these games completely from scratch. The first one I kind of started on my own and built a game out of it. That's actually how I met Tommy. It's a longer story, but this Swedish guy walked up to me at Game Developers Conference and beat me at my own game because he had been playing it competitively in his office back in Sweden. So that's 2009. That was the start of our relationship. And Branislav I've known for 7 years now almost. I wanted to actually make a 3D version of that first game I mentioned, Cortex Command, which is a 2D side-scrolling game. It's kind of like Worms, where you dig into the ground and every pixel had its own material properties. And I wanted to make a 3D version of that because it was a successful game for me. And I looked around for voxel technologies. This is again many years ago, and I found Branislav's work on his website, where he was doing everything with a shoestring budget, kind of being funded by donations, public donations, but also from family. I understand a little bit.
My brother.
Yeah, Peter's here actually, so he's part of the story. Yeah. And I thought his technology was the most convincing, most legit thing I saw of everything else I looked at. And he only had videos up, so there was no downloadable demos or anything like this. So I just heard him speak about his vision and his technology, and it clicked. Like for me, it sounded like it was the real deal. I don't know how much you guys have followed voxel technology, but there's been some stuff that wasn't really the real deal in my opinion. I'm not going to elaborate, but there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of wishful thinking, and I thought Branislav's work again was the most legit seeming. So I started talking to him. I started donating very modest amounts, what I could afford as an indie developer, because I wanted to license this technology for my game. Again, that was kind of my mindset. Until a few years ago, I started actually talking to Branislav more and more. We kind of struck up a friendship, and we eventually met in person at Gamescom, I think, a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And we kind of clicked in person. There was chemistry there too. So I kept showing. He trusted me. I was the first person who was entrusted with a demonstration version of this technology, like various demos. I was running around with a laptop with the only demo version of this stuff, and I showed it to Tommy a couple of times over the years, and kind of wheels started turning in his head too, and he started seeing the potential of it. I was still in the mindset of I want to just make a game with this technology, so I was trying to help Branislav, make it a reality. Tommy told me this technology is amazing, but one guy is not going to be able to make this. And Branislav was already on this mindset. He knew he needed to build a team to make something out of this. And Tommy told me, he needs to find someone who's like a business-minded guy who's going to do the business stuff and build this company with him while he focuses on the technology. And I started thinking, who can I find, right? Who can I come up with who can be this person? And Tommy eventually made the coin drop in my head that maybe that should be you, because you already have a good relationship with him and trust, and there's this chemistry going on. And I do have some experience now after having grown this company. And so that was about, I think, April of last year, actually, when that happened. And that's when the coin dropped, and we started talking about, okay, maybe we should start this company together and have this be more than just a game for me. This is a bigger thing that can happen in the world, and it really spans outside of games in a big way. You'll see that in this presentation. So I'll just start. I don't know, Brian, if you have anything to say before we start with the...
Yeah, maybe one thing, there were other companies interested in voxel technologies or alternatives to polygon technologies, and there are big players and many small players that were interested in this particular technology when I was still working alone on it. But I wasn't interested in cooperation with those companies because none of the offers made sense given the big vision I had. I wanted to basically trigger a paradigm shift in computer graphics from polygons to volumetric technology, and these companies had their own goals. And when I met with Tommy, a visionary in his field, it was instantly obvious to me that if I work with this person and with Dan, who helps me with that, we can actually start something that makes sense. And maybe after a couple of years, or 2 years at most, we can actually become relevant in this space because nobody else is trying really hard. And at the same time, those who actually tried to make voxel technologies big have failed because they made mistakes I tried to avoid. And that's what really happened. I avoided making a game or focusing on just visualization technology, and I started this company with the right people. And so there we are.
Here we are, yeah. And so we formed this company late last year, finally. And in all fairness, like I was approaching Branislav in the beginning, with the ambition to make a game. I wasn't trying to change the world or anything, but I saw the vision that he had. He was sitting in front of his computer narrating his thoughts about, the big goals that he had. And it started kind of making wheels turn in my head as well, that eventually made me make this change in my course and my decision of joining him on that journey instead of just making another game, so to speak. So anyway, this conversation today is really about this vision that Branislav had first, but I'm completely bought into at this point after talking to him for years and listening to his vision, and I totally understand and see it. It's also been validated a lot. We've been meeting with a lot of investors, very smart people in the world, and there's not been a case so far where people say this is bullshit, this is not going to happen, this thesis you have is not, ever, we've never had that. We've had the opposite. We've had the time, the experience that people sit with us longer and they really, if not explicitly tell us that this is going to happen and we believe you, they have this glint in their eye usually, and it's an interesting validation, so to speak. So we want to share this vision with you guys. We believe it's inevitable, which is a big part of the title here, and I'll go into that here immediately. What do we mean by inevitable? It's something that is going to happen whether we like it or not, or whether we are going to do it or not. We believe that, especially with Branislav's work, which is 15 years on this problem, which I'll talk about in a second, this will happen sooner or later anyway. With his work, it'll happen sooner rather than later. But it just makes sense. If you think long enough about this, and about this is what I'm hoping to present here, is that voxels really are the 3D geometry of tomorrow. And it's the tomorrow is about to turn into today sooner because of Branislav's crazy amount of work on this one problem. Really, it's kind of unprecedented. I was looking around very hard for any kind of technologies, and I couldn't find anything better, honestly. We've since looked together and we can't find anything. And we're talking to large companies, small companies. We're trying to see what's out there and so far. But that's beside the point. This is going to happen sooner or later. Go ahead. Oh, I thought you were. No. Okay, so Carmack, you guys are familiar with, made Doom and all these very cool games. He had this very interesting quote in a random article where he said media types go through phases of adoption that end in sampling as the dominant distribution method. And he gives these 3 examples. One is audio, where before there was like MIDI and all these different music formats, but now as soon as MP3 came around, everything switched to MP3. All audio is compressed in a similar way to MP3, whether it's MP3 or OGG or whatever. And then he also mentioned, high resolution pictures, JPEG is kind of the thing there that happened. That is now kind of the final form of high resolution 2D images. And then 2D video, MP4, YouTube, Netflix, all these things are built on that technology. As soon as you come up with both the hardware that can support this and the software algorithms, as soon as those two things exist in the world, it jumps to the media types jump to sampling, where you're sampling this this information at a certain frequency, and you can compress it and so on. And this is really what happens. So we realized what voxels are is the 3D version of that, right? And that's a reason. So Tim Sweeney is another, he made Unreal and all this stuff, and he says that it's clear that voxels play, these are quotes that have big impact because of these guys,
And it's interesting that with MP3s, the transition happened like very quickly and very early on. Not even all PCs, big desktop PCs, were able to play back MP3s really well, so far I can remember. But we can say quite clearly that the hardware today is ready for voxels, and it has been for at least like 5, 6, 7 years. But this big paradigm shift is not happening yet, and that's because the software is still not there. Even while it's obvious for people like Carmack and Ken Silverman, the guy behind the build engine used in Duke Nukem 3D and a couple other games, and John Olick and other great developers, like these guys knew that this paradigm shift should happen since like 2000, 2002. Some of them have spent more than 5 years working on this, and they so far didn't create results that would be amazing. So it's kind of obvious the hardware is powerful enough, but the shift hasn't occurred yet. So this is the funny thing, like in the other areas like audio and music and 2D images and video, it happened instantly as soon as it was possible, as soon as the hardware was strong enough. Not in this case. So
also the software.
Yeah, so we're the ones basically who are trying to make the software happen, because other companies are not doing it.
And again, we see this as inevitable. Like if we don't do it, someone else will eventually. And this is just something that seems to happen. And this is a pattern that Carmack saw. All these different media types. Like this is something that happens, the final form, so to speak. And there's the reason for that. We'll talk about. So I have a couple of sub topics here that I'll dive into. So the benefits first. Volumetrically sampled and structured geometry. That's a mouthful, but we'll talk about why we talk about it. Like the structure here we're talking about really is that voxels are just pixels in 3D, right? Like it's 2D pixels, but there's another dimension. It's a simple, uncomplicated structure. Pretty much everyone can be explained to understand this. Like it's not that tricky. There's no references to other things going on, and we'll talk about why that's going on with polygons, and it really messes things up. Because it's such a simple structure, it's simple upsampling and downsampling, and because it's structured at all, it makes it possible. And there's this inherent level of detail feature of voxels that really makes so many things possible that make it a superior way of describing 3D data. This is a simple picture that kind of shows what we're talking about. This is a picture of and most of the visuals that we show are from our technology just because it's available to us, but it's also some of the best we've seen out there. And we'll show you demos, live demos, that we'll show you actually some really cool stuff later on. And this is a low resolution version just to kind of make the point that everything is little cubes that are structured in a grid, a regular grid. But what if those cubes are so small that you can barely see them? Now we have some interesting results, right? Like this does run in real time. We can show you guys this demo later. And this is really what we're talking about. Oops, sorry. Wow, that's not intended. Really the change between this and this, the jump, this is kind of trivial to do implementation-wise, like get this result with this resolution. There's many actual programs out there, like Magic of Voxel, I think is one, that you can model something like this in, no problem. But going from that to this is a huge technical challenge. That's 10 plus years of hard R&D that Branislav has been able to do, and as far as I can tell, nobody else has so far. Anyway, so continuing here, because we have these inherent level of details and the structure going on, it compresses really well. Any kind of data in this format can get compressed extremely well and stream really well, just like a 2D video does with YouTube. If you're watching YouTube on your phone and you have a crappy connection, it'll just downsample it. It'll look kind of crummy, but you can still see the video to some degree. It won't be like 4K, but you still have that experience. And this is very important, especially when we start talking about this stuff we'll get into later. You can also model insides of things. Polygons, you really can't. Volumes in general, volumetric stuff like smoke and these kind of effects, you kind of have to fake with polygons where you have billboards and so on. It's something you could do inherently with voxels kind of in a very natural way. This is a big one. Content authoring is super intuitive. It's like working in clay for both professionals and casual people. Like we talked about Minecraft before. It's a great kind of example of this. Children building incredible things like the Spaceship Enterprise and so on, because they have simple building blocks or simple intuitive ways of doing things. So once you start digging into this very high resolution, high fidelity character, you can go crazy. You can carve out the whole, it's kind of macabre, honestly. But you can go all the way through him. You know, this is what it looks like on the back when you do that. This would be very difficult to try to get this result with a polygonal model. It's just what is on the inside, how do you deal with all this extra complexity that the user just added to this model on top of what was already there before. You hit polygon limits very quickly. So going on here, simulations are easier. You can do it at any LOD. So if you have atmospheric effects like a cloud, you want to simulate that, you can do that at a very low LOD of the voxels, like large voxels. It could be several meter large ones, and they will still be a reasonable effect. Structural integrity stuff, you know, a building, if you hack half of the building off, you want it to actually collapse and so on. That doesn't have to be done at the millimeter level voxel size, but it can be done at a much lower LOD and still be a good effect. And that you're saving, of course, a lot of computational time there. And that's kind of like inherent with this. It's all coming from the low complexity that lets you do, and the structure of it that lets you do LODs. And now you can actually do these simulations much easier. This is a big one we talk about later too, a universal format that could capture all 3D and 4D. And 4D we just mean animated voxels essentially, and we have videos, or not videos, live demos of that showing volumetric video. But imagine if you had in the 2D world just one image format, like not JPEGs and GIFs and some video format, you know, but you thought it through and you managed to make one format that's kind of universal, and now you can do all of those things in the one format. The really powerful thing with that I'll get into later, but you can imagine grabbing assets from a game to put into your video or volumetric video, or vice versa, or from a medical app and put it into a simulation, some kind of experience. This is super powerful stuff. So in the end here, it's very parallelizable. You can actually scale these calculations up. Most of these demos we're going to show you are actually running on one thread on the CPU. It's just because we haven't had time. It's really Branislav sitting with this solo up to this point, more or less, and having just one thread being able to do the stuff we can show you is already impressive. But the fact that fundamentally you could very easily, not easily, but it's not a huge barrier to get this running on multiple threads or in the cloud, and you can have massive simulations that are just kind of chopping up the world into pieces that get simulated separately. And all this is only possible if the voxels can be processed fast enough for real-time simulations on common computers. And this is kind of the clincher. Up till now, you know, voxels has been around as a concept since the 70s. But how come we don't have voxels instead of polygons as the kind of dominant way of doing things? It's this problem. I'll talk more about this later. Anyway, so other ways of representing 3D, there's huge drawbacks. And this is kind of the mirror image of the past slide I just talked about. All these different things we'll talk about, like polygons, point clouds, other things like sign distance fields and so on. These are incomplete approximations of reality. They only talk about surfaces, for example, so there's nothing inside. And these have huge implications. Try to do like drilling through that character, you know, there's nothing there, so what do you show there? If it's points only, you know, it's a cloud of points, literally, there's no matter there. Like trying to do physics on that, where you're colliding one thing against another, it's extremely difficult and expensive to do because you have to check all these points in a cloud, and it's just, there's no structure. And that's really what point clouds lack versus voxels. there's a lot of confusion between what point clouds are. A lot of point clouds are called voxels by people who should know better, honestly. Even in the industry we've talked to, and when you really look at it, it's clear that there's not actual structure to it. So there's all these benefits of compression and so on and physics simulations are kind of go lost on that. Light and so on, we can talk about light fields a lot as well, but these are just kind of incomplete approximations of reality. Again, like if you only look at light, how do you do physics on that? It's kind of unknown at this point.
Yeah, I would say one representation, one important is missing there. It's particle systems, but they are super expensive if you think about huge balls. Like you can simulate some little chunk of water or something like that, but you can't define a world made of, I don't know, 10 trillion particles and make it an efficient solution. So particles would be pretty good, but they are too expensive to actually be useful.
Yeah, and I'll talk about like why. There's a common thread between all of these things, and it's really, okay, we'll talk about, it's polygons, point clouds, example of point clouds. This STF is a horrible picture, sorry, I didn't have a lot of examples of STFs. They're kind of experimental at this point, but the upsampling and downsampling is really generally difficult. It's not impossible, and there's a lot of solutions for polygons that people have worked hard on over the years. They're really clever solutions to make LODs kind of automatically, semi-automatically. They're expensive, but they're also very just generally difficult to do. It's not something that comes inherently. You have to really be clever about the way you go about it. And if you want to have a higher LOD on one part of your model versus another, that's a whole nother ballgame. That's extra hard. And in voxels, for example, it's trivial. Again, you can just have higher resolution there in wherever you want.
I would say the absolutely worst things are combined effects. Like you have a huge model where you have to manage the LOD dynamically, but the model also explodes or gets damaged or interacted with destructively, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
If you combine these effects, you run into troubles with whatever solution you have out there based on polygons.
I want to ask real quick, how much time do we actually have at this point? When is this supposed to end?
About
because it's 7:30, right?
1.5 hours.
Okay, great. So we're around on time. So all these things result, again, this is the mirror image. Like we have inefficient compression because mostly all of this data is vector data. So they have explicit coordinates, like, point cloud, there's a point here, there's a point here, there's a point here. All those numbers need to be saved, basically. It's very hard to compress that. With polygons, it's the same. You have vertices that are connected, and they're kind of like in a cloud, essentially. That's what a model is.
UV coordinates.
Well, and then you have UVs on top of that, and that's a whole other thing. The complexity of UV mapping is a real nasty thing, honestly, and it's something that people have lived with for so long in this industry, and any industry that deals with 3D graphics, that I feel some people have become numb to the pain of UVs. Like it's just the way it is, and we have to deal with it. But there's another way. There's a way to not have that complexity.
Yeah, but regarding the vector data, both positions and UVs are basically the distribution of those numbers is pretty random, so you can't compress it really well. That shows the difference between a JPEG that works with some small segments of pixel data, where only the pixels are sampled in whatever way. You don't store any additional position information for every pixel, right? So you only store and compress the information you actually want to see in the result. So that's so great about, let's say, pictures like JPEGs and also voxels. But vector information like polygon meshes or point clouds or even particles have these drawbacks of having many vector components. And so you want, with very complex geometry that's becoming like very close to the real world, you run into huge problems with compressing such data.
Yeah, and a trick that actually the industry has been doing for a long time is really textures, right? So you want that high fidelity, the high frequency detail in your data, but you can't really store it in vertices. Like it would be a crazy high poly model. So what you do instead is you're mapping to a structured data, which is a 2D texture or several 2D textures, right? And that's where you have some kind of structure. It's a place where you can compress things and texture compression is there's several businesses that are built around just that, making that work as good as possible. And so it's a way to get around this, but it's a very awkward thing. You have a vector data clump, and then there's structured data, and you're making a connection between the two. And this is really throwing the wrench into a lot of things like simulation or letting people edit these assets with simple tools, because the tools are super complex. And we'll talk about, I can show that right here. It's like UV mapping and all this stuff. And this is a random picture I got off the internet. Someone's trying to help someone else, I guess, with some pointers. But it's like all these issues you have to think about, and you have to have this crazy UI to even do the UV mapping. This is another example. It's a simple radio model, I think, or something like that, but there's so much going on with the UV mapping and unwrapping and all this stuff, and apparently someone flipped the texture or something. It's just, it's a mess. And anyone who's not a professional, who didn't go to school or really put in years of work trying to understand these tools to master this kind of complexity, they're kind of lost. Like, they're not going to be able to change this asset in a significant way without these crazy tools. They're expensive and just complex. So anyway, we have many different data formats because of implementations of this complexity are different. So now we have lots of different formats. It's hard to convert between them. It's hard to use assets from one game into another. These asset store and so on, Unity is trying to help that, which is cool. But still, there's all these different formats. It's a problem. Content authorship, we just mentioned, is very difficult. Heavy tool chains, and literally the craziest UIs that exist in computers, are 3D programming or 3D modeling packages. And so that's what we're dealing with when we want to edit anything here. It's hard to do simulations with entropic and destructive results. So if you have combustion, like things can burn or so on, it's very difficult to do this if your textures are kind of locked and you're not able to do anything except kind of slap more textures on there with decals and so on. And in general, this is a fundamental thing. Like, there's no really straight lines or sharp corners in nature. So trying to model things with literally straight lines and sharp corners, which polygons are, it's not ideal. It's just organic shapes are not very suitable for this kind of thing.
So when you think about this, like when you think about the big picture and virtual reality is like the Oasis or Matrix, just few years from now, with, I don't know, tens or hundreds of millions of people in such worlds who want to interact with the worlds in ways they are used to in the real world. Like, imagine just, I don't know, 10 million children who want to play and create and destroy without caring about the complexities of the polygon approach. If you think about such a product that allows this, the complexity of a polygon solution will just explode. And from this perspective, all the solutions, all those tools, all those complexities, all those UV mappings, normal maps, displacement maps, all kinds of maps, all that is basically technical debt. It's not just one particular technique that will go away, let's say normal maps, right? It's everything. Because if you just can't build the thing everybody will share just a couple of years from now, or maybe almost a decade from now, if you can't build it with that approach and you have to work with a different approach that is completely different, like fundamentally different, that really is technical debt.
Yeah.
The whole polygon industry is basically suffocating in a technical debt that will have to be removed.
It's a strong statement, but I'll get into more details about that. And a really good analogy to think about is the 2D again. Like, you look at what Flash had its heyday, years ago, when vector data was a way to communicate. It was kind of a complex structure to it, but Flash is not around anymore because MP4s and so on can go 4K resolution, and you just whatever you tried to communicate with Flash, you can now do with these very efficient streaming sampled ways of doing things. So literally, Flash is dead. Like, I think Adobe killed it a couple of years ago, like formally. So anyway, we have a big obstacle that I mentioned before is like scaling voxels from the millions to billions, which is what you need to do when you go from blocks that are big and visible to blocks that you can barely see. And these obstacles demand big plans and even bigger efforts. And that's kind of what Branislav really has been doing I picked some random analogous thing, but it's working on a problem for 10 years. Like SpaceX in the U.S. has been working on rockets for about as long, I think, and now they're doing amazing things finally. But voxels present this cubic problem. It's not just like a TV where you go from full HD to 4K and you have a hell of a lot more pixels. That's square, right? If you have cubic, now it's increasing a lot more when you try to up the resolution, and that's a huge data management problem, really. And many have tried to attack voxels, right?
It's actually 4-dimensional problem.
Okay.
Because you have to deal with LODs, which kind of make things.
And then you have time on top of that.
It's like 100 times more difficult to make a proper voxel engine with LODs than without, because without you just have an array or some tiny blocks sticking together. That's trivial. You can make something like that work in a week, basically. But if you want a proper solution, you have to put years of man work into it.
Clearly. So because people have tried, even people like John Carmack and other people like Ron mentioned, they've tried and they ended up doing that because they were trying to make a game, and spending 10 years on R&D just to make a game doesn't really make business sense. I know this personally, and the other people kind of came with the wrong approach of they tried to make pretty pictures happen on the screen, and they managed to do that with voxels, but then they didn't realize that the real problem, or they realized it too late, was that making simulation happen, which happens globally, right? Rendering happens in a frustum. It's whatever the viewer is seeing. It's kind of a small part, but simulations where there's physics and things going on around you, that happens globally. Now you have to read and write to this very large database very efficiently and in a very clever way. And that's where a lot of people just ran into this wall. Again, they didn't have 10 years of motivation and effort to put into this. So when we say this is inevitable, that doesn't mean that we can all just relax and rely on someone else. I mean, you guys can, but Bruno can, and he hasn't. It's not something that will happen on its own. Peter Thiel has this great quote that the future won't happen on its own. Some people have to have the vision, they have to plan, and they have to execute. And it's the execution part is the hardest. It's the effort of 10 years of really kind of doing this is a tough part. But the rewards is really going from 0 to 1, which is bringing something new to the world that didn't exist before. And then the world can spread it all over the world and make it a global phenomenon, but it has to start somewhere, and it comes from usually a team led by a few individuals who are very driven, very passionate, have this vision, and they drive to make it happen. So that's kind of where we are finding ourselves today, and it's exciting for us, but we really want to talk to you guys about this kind of situation that we see and we're frustrated by, and that we're working on changing. So the current state of things, well, first of all, is there any questions at this point? Because I would love to, if not, okay, yeah, go ahead.
You promised that you would explain how the polygons came to be the dominant technology.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I have the...
well, there is one good reason why they became the dominant technology. Is because you have textures there and you can reuse the same texture very trivially, multiple tens of thousands of times in the same scene. The geometry will look horrible, we know that from the past, but it's a way how to go. You can rasterize it easily this way with that one texture maybe, and it will work.
More generally, I do have a slide about this. There's reasons why Flash was dominant, kind of dominant in web graphics for a while. It's because it's a shortcut to get cool visuals going. But it's a shortcut that has sacrifices, in the fidelity you can achieve eventually, and also in 3D, it's like the dynamic nature of it. And I'll talk about it in a second, so we'll get to it. Go ahead.
Maybe, what do you exactly mean by that voxels are easy to upsample? What do you actually mean by that?
To upsample? So
yeah, I mean,
you saw that lower resolution version of that weird mushroom guy.
downsample.
That was downsampled, right? Upsampling, again, you can think of it in 2D, right? Like you do that with textures all the time, bilinear filtering. You're adding intermediate things between, and that's if you have a structured format, which a 2D texture is, right?
Okay.
and you just upsample that, you can do that. You end up with a kind of blurry thing, right? Like you're upsampling and you end up with blurry. Some games have in the past, and I think still do, they add a detail texture, right? So there's a separate texture that gets added in the upsampling process. So you kind of, now if you look really close at this wall, for example, that has kind of, too low resolution for this distance, you can fade in more. And you can do this in 3D as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, but have you found a good way how to do that? Because things get really sometimes ugly when it comes to, right? I mean, when it's really hard to upsample voxels to look good, right? To get rid of the bulkiness when you get close, that's a really hard problem. I mean, I only see it partly done. I think it was in 3D code, which is a 3D sculpting program, and they kind of handle it pretty well.
Right.
But they use probably some margin key, whatever advanced, but they still cover it in polygons.
Right.
So I don't have idea how it can be done, I guess.
It's not totally trivial because in some surfaces that have very shallow steepness, you end up with some starry look, right?
Staircase look, yeah.
Yes, something like that. So if you want to make it perfect, you likely will want to bake into the voxel representation something like SDF, a signed distance field, that lets you approximate some kind of surface smoothly, and you can add some more complexity into it using noise or texture. I wouldn't go this way because I was thinking about other ways that will come maybe next year. So there are multiple ways, but what we want to do is to make a solution that works in real time and that provides great results. And I haven't seen such solutions out there yet.
Yeah.
So we will.
Yeah, thanks. One of our goals is to really, in the end, not ever present to a viewer visible blocks, right? So if they do get close to this wall or some object, and the data in that database or the model itself isn't enough resolution to kind of present them those, invisible blocks, so to speak, or retina resolution, it would be to have a solution that is very clever. And again, like this, it's not trivial. Like you're inventing.
It's not hard. Really.
Well, everything's relative. Okay, so programming anything is hard for a lot of people. So, but it's kind of the and that's, I think, the reason we make that statement is compared to polygons. I think polygons are also not trivial to upsample. You can do it. You can add intermediate things. Subdivisions are a great example of that. Totally.
Well, that is kind of easy today.
Yeah.
When everyone knows how to do it.
It's easy today after a multi-billion industry has put 10 plus years into it.
And we'll definitely make that point.
But I mean, the algorithm is not that hard. I mean,
Yeah.
It's kind of simple.
He actually implemented it over the weekend, the Catmull Clark, because we needed it for some of these demos that we want to show. But that's a good point. It's not trivial, but it is something that's doable, and we have a plan to do it.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I would say any kind of improvement of this kind, working with this simple voxel structure, basically a 3D grid of samples, these algorithms or techniques are rather easy to implement, and we can see it on the actual results. Like when one guy can implement so many things from scratch without being an expert in any of those, when he's using voxels, while it took many teams, or let's say a whole industry, to do similar things with polygons. It just shows how easy it is to work with voxels, how the human intuition is good at coming up with solutions for this kind of Lego kind of geometry, right? While with polygons, there is so much complexity that make them work so well today that if you want to create another improvement, you have to spend a lot of time and effort, money, everything to actually make such improvements. And we can see it in games. Like, you can't do simple things like, let's say, I don't know if you do want to do it or something, but you can't spill acid, or scratch a wall really easily and leave a scratch mark there that is really like three-dimensional, and do it here and there in unique ways millions of times. You end up with a mess. So these improvements are quite easy to do in a voxel way, but the technical depth in polygon technology is already so high that it's super hard to do it there.
Yeah, and I'll get into that here too. So this is kind of where we are really soon, actually, because this is where we are right now in 3D simulation and graphics. I feel we're stuck in a world where we're kind of there. You see the current, and we're moving through this local maximum, right? Like we're optimizing for this way of doing things, which is not the global maximum. There's a better way, a better design out there, and we're finding that we're getting these stagnating results, both on the business and production side, but also the presentation, kind of an output side, what people experience in the end. So let's talk about this real quick. So we have ballooning budgets and diminishing returns in games. Ralph Koster did an awesome article in Gamma Sutra where he shows that development costs, production costs only, this is not marketing at all, is exploding. This is a logarithmic scale. So every 10 years is about a 10-time increase in costs for making games. And it's kind of bananas. He got a lot of data points going here. He admits it's not, the best data set. He could come up with better, but it's a pretty clear trend, and it's pretty scary, honestly, because when you start looking at, and so why is this cost going up so much? There's interesting discussion by veteran game developers online. They say, the vast majority of money goes into asset creation. The character on the left was, could be made by one artist over a couple of weeks, maybe including the rigging, animation, and stuff. On the right, there's a whole team of people working on it for months. And you extend that to all the assets in the game, it's going to be an incredible increase in the amount of not only skill, but the expense that all these skilled people need to make it happen. So he does an interesting thing where he actually calculates the cost per byte of the installed game. So we're delivering a size, and it's costing a certain amount. This content takes up a certain amount of hard disk space, and you can argue like consumers are not paying for gigabytes being used on their hard drive. They're paying for fun, but even a bad game costs money, right? Like even a totally not fun game costs money to make that content. So this is still kind of interesting, and he points out it's a troubling thing to him that it seems like this cost per byte is plateauing. It used to go down, but something started happening where there's plateau. And there's different theories he puts out. One is that, kind of Unity and Unreal happened around 2005. I don't know what you can derive from that, but, you draw your own conclusions. There's other things that he points out here is a forecast of the average cost per megabyte of making is going down, but it's slow. The average player price per megabyte is really going down, and it's, he's showing that the payment per megabyte is going to hit like zero, essentially. So it's free to play, which is already happening. And it's going to, in 2020, it's going to be basically zero. So how do we deal with that as an industry? That's not what this talk is about. I'm just trying to make a point that costs are ballooning, and AAA games, they'll hit an average cost of like $200 million for a really high quality game, and by 2020, which is a couple of years away. And the third thing he talks about here is that the thing that will happen is that more games will become system driven, meaning UGC and simulation will be something that games will have to rely on more. Trying to make games that have unique content all the way through is just not going to be practical according to these graphs. It's just, you're going to have thousands of people in a studio trying to make something that keeps up with these trends, and it's just not going to be, it's going to be a cap essentially that you're going to hit eventually. So this is kind of a grim picture of our industry as a whole on the business side. On the kind of output side and the technology side, what we're getting over the years is prettier pictures. Like we've been really racing towards having extremely realistic looking pictures on the screen, but it comes at a cost. So it's really interactivity, and I'll talk about that in a second. There's this blurb here about how the results in terms of interactivity and immersion that people really want, and you can tell by certain figures I'll show in a second, they can't be supported by the current paradigms. immersive experiences that we see in movies like fantasies, like Ready Player One was, depicting, as a movie recently by Spielberg, depicted these amazing virtual worlds where like everything is blowing up. Like King Kong is smashing the whole city just to get to your car, which is having all this destructible stuff going on. And it's just not conceivably possible to do this with polygonal solutions, especially if it's multiplayer, especially if it just doesn't scale as far as we can tell. Another one is Blade Runner, very compelling, kind of AI hologram people interacting with people. It can't be canned animations. These have to be kind of real-time simulations going on. Classic, the lobby scene from The Matrix. That The Matrix is supposed to be a virtual simulation. How do you simulate all that stuff going on? When that pillar is being shot to crap. And there's dust and particles, and it's getting eaten away by bullets.
It can be done with multiple hacks or whatever.
Yeah, with hacks, and that's what games like Battlefield do. This, right? They have an artist sit there and make the more destroyed version of something like that pillar, and then when the bullet hits it, they swap it out, right? But someone had to sit there or make that, or there's procedural ways, but they don't look very good, and they end up being kind of limited.
The problem is that many people will want to live in those virtual environments.
Live. Yeah.
Okay. Many will want to play. Many will want to do experiments, whatever. And for this to actually happen, to make it possible, that virtual environment has to be simulated globally in a way similar as the real world works.
Yeah.
Do we talk about it?
Yeah, it's right here. It's
great.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
it's really user-generated, remixed, or destroyed content, or globally simulated phenomena like forest fires or plants growing.
Yeah, plants, worms, anything.
Yeah.
Like if
acid, rain.
if that world, if people want to feel like in something real, that world has to work in such ways. It can't just look that way or be predefined in such a way, pre-created by somebody else. And this complexity, this synergies of all the effects of physics and chemistry and biology and the acts of artificial agents and humans that interact in there. For this to occur, you have to have a simulated environment, and that environment, of course, has to be volumetric, otherwise it can't be really simulated well.
Yeah. And this is to the point of your question before, is like, the industry has been in an arms race trying to get the best graphics, right? Like Crisis or whatever game is the most, that's kind of what everyone paid attention to. But having the optimizing for rendering kind of output and having even the hardware rendering kind of go in that direction, has been at the expense of like this deep user interactivity. And this example is this counter position just drives that point home, I think. So this is Uncharted 2, right? Gorgeous game, gorgeous characters, released in 2009, almost 10 years ago now, actually. Time flies. Production budget, 20 million, that was a big budget back then. Sales to date, 6 million units, total hit, right? Like it was won many Game of the Year awards that year. But it's basically a content-heavy movie where there's no different endings. Like you can affect the action a little bit. You get to shoot guys and so on, but the story is the same every time. And a whole army of people worked on this content. All right, so juxtapose it with another game that was released in 2009 initially, and I just want you to look at the graphics differences, like the characters especially, and it's kind of like interesting to look at this, right? Because production budget, it's kind of hard to pin down. I mean, this was an indie game made by one guy initially, but he gathered a team and so on. So over the years, who knows how much has been poured into this, especially by Microsoft recently. But this is an epitome of a sandbox game, right? Like there was a story mode eventually, but that was after it was a hit already. But really, people generate their own stories with this kind of thing. It's a simulated world. It's procedurally generated. It's different every time. It's a story generator, because when you're experiencing the game, you're doing things just like kids do in a real sandbox, in a real playground. They come up with stories, and they have little characters that and they just make this stuff up, and there are different stories every time. the sales numbers, look at this, is the more than order of magnitude difference. This is really the market speaking. Like, I think Minecraft is such a cool example because it's like, it clearly is not competing on graphics. That's my generous, assessment. and it's still extremely competitive in what people actually wanted because of this procedural simulated way of letting people do whatever the heck they wanted and have this deep interactivity. You dig into the ground, you can build, Mordor, you can do whatever you want. And this is a very important thing. So we have some demos that we can show you guys at this point, kind of break up the monotony. I don't know how we're doing on time. Do we have another half hour or hour?
Yeah, well,
we have discussion at the end, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
so we can show some demos real quick and then talk about whatever you like to talk about.
Yeah. So we're going to show you a series of demos that are, this is actually an older demo that ran on Branislav's computer for a long time. It was an old computer even like years ago. It was like a gaming computer.
I don't remember.
Yeah. But you saw some screenshots, but I just want to make sure that you really see that these are cubes, right? Everything is made out of cubes. If I back up, and you'll see some LED popping. This is an older demo. We fixed a lot of these issues, or Branislav has. But it shows that there's a lot of cubes in this scene. It's not infinite to the end of the horizon, like Minecraft is. But in this particular demo, there's about 5 billion voxels or so. It's rendering at over 100 frames a second, which is great for VR. And this does run in VR. We have a VR kit here, so if there's time after this, we can actually have you guys try that out. The cool thing again with voxels is you can do the Minecraft thing. I can go in here and dig through anything, and I can go through the whole world. And you'll see the LED popping again. This is the older demo. You'll see that go away later. This demo has some cool things. There's still some LED popping, is that what you're saying? It's all his fault. But the other cool thing to show in this particular demo, there's physics going on. And you're seeing no polygons basically at all. You have these vehicles that are actually also all cubes. This is one of the things that blew my mind when I saw Branislav's demos, is that I had in my mind that voxels were kind of like stuck in a grid. Every voxel had to be stuck in a grid, and it's not the case. You can have groups or objects like this where they rotate in their own coordinate system, and they can even be deformed, like in a soft body type way, and we have demos for that too. So this really kind of opens up the possibilities in my mind of what can be done. You're not limited to having some kind of re-rasterization every frame or something like that. And again, you can do the same things. I can turn this into a convertible vehicle or have damage, battle damage and get shot, or I lose half the wheel, and now the physics are updated. So this is kind of like a very cool gameplay possibility. Another cool thing about this vehicle is that it is made from a polygonal object or an asset that used to be a low poly kind of game asset. You can see the tessellation happening here that was then voxelized. The other vehicle is a higher poly model that has all these curves and so on, and kind of silly detail in the what used to be the polygonal model that is now also voxelized. And once it's voxelized, it doesn't really matter. The poly count is not relevant anymore. So as long as you have the resolution in the voxels to capture the detail you want, you're good. This is a big, big deal. So again, I can do all the things that we did before. I can go in also and build to this blob, for example, and now I'm adding to it. This is the most primitive possible tool. I'm just adding blobs wherever. That looks a little phallic, sorry about that. But now, you can imagine a Mad Max game where you're customizing your vehicle and adding spikes and stuff. The spikes do have physical effects. Like if I add some stuff in the ground here.
Only some physical.
Yeah, it's not a perfect mapping right now. So these are tests that Branislav did like how many years ago? Whoa, that's
not sure.
So this should have an effect on, oh crap, if I can just hit it.
5 years maybe.
5 years ago, yeah. So there is physical, I just kind of beached myself on that thing. So, as a game developer, game designer, the possibilities are exploding in front of me and just seeing this. And this is the first of many demos that we can show. Let's see here if we can go.
The point here is that you can edit the geometry and never care about polygon counts or the complexity that comes with polygons using textures, multiple textures. You don't have to care about it and just interact with the world.
Yeah. So that's a cool game example. Yeah, it's a cool game example we just showed. Here we're going to show something. I think actually two of the guys from this company here locally are in the audience, like Skeletex.
Skeletex Research.
Yeah. Those guys.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah. It's Adam and I'm bad with names, but you guys are here and
Martin.
we appreciate. Yeah, Martin. That's right. So they gave us some data to show kind of like a different application. They with structured light captured in depth this girl playing the guitar, and it's complete. And then we voxelize that output, and it's just a playback, so to speak. And even though it's kind of a simple thing, it's not necessarily technically challenging. Or what would you say? What we're doing?
Yeah, I don't know. Show the FPS maybe.
Yeah. So that's kind of the important part. Like the frame rate here is over 500, 600 frames a second on this very simple data set. Honestly, it's a simple data set, but it really has this effect that could be very compelling. Like this reminds me of that scene in Minority Report where Tom Cruise is sitting there kind of reminiscing over his family he lost some tragic way. And he's putting these weird holographic things into his machine, and it's like projecting them in some kind of depth. We basically have it here today already. And it's again a very simple data set, but it kind of gets across that there's a person sitting there, and that you can, if you knew this woman and you see her doing her thing, you would remember her and kind of maybe have some emotional reaction to that.
So these were point clouds turned into voxels.
Yeah.
The other examples you can see, most of them were polygon meshes turned into voxels.
Yeah. Should I do the other volumetric video example?
Which ones?
Well, the one with the three guys.
Three guys.
Yeah. That's what you can. Yeah. Okay. So this is a more kind of vivid example of this, where we're not just simulating kind of game assets or something, but we have real-world captured data that was given to us in this case. Again, we don't have this equipment that's required. Like it's dozens, if not 100 cameras looking from outside in on a subject and taking video from every conceivable angle and then doing photogrammetry or really videogrammetry at that point if you're capturing in video. So I can increase the playback speed of this guy. You'll see that we're rendering at quite higher than what we were playing back. And the result is quite interesting because you can view this guy from any angle, right? That's kind of obvious because it is volumetric. The really interesting thing to me is his t-shirt, honestly. Trying to do that with authored content where you're actually sitting in Maya trying to reproduce these kind of wrinkles and stuff, it's not something you do easily, if at all. And this is really kind of like the uncanny valley problem that all CG, it's the holy grail, is to skip the uncanny valley. And the way you reliably skip the uncanny valley is to use photography, right? You're even where there's all kinds of errors with this guy, like there's weird stuff going on in his mouth, obviously this polygon soup happening behind his back.
Yeah, that was just 180 degrees.
Yeah, so the camera is only capturing the front, and that's why we have noise in the back there. But especially in VR, and I'm hoping we have some time to let you guys try it out, because you can put on the VR headset, you have the stereoscopy, you look at this guy's face, your brain kind of thinks I'm in his space, I'm too close to him or something. You get this kind of visceral, and it means that your brain has bought the fact that there's a human being there. It's not weirded out by like, this is something that looks like a human, but it's actually not, and I have this disgust feeling. You actually feel like there's a human being because of all this wrinkles and all this stuff back here. Yes, please.
Is it possible to do rigging with this kind of stuff?
That's an awesome question. It's something we get very often. I mean, this is a canned animation, of course, right? So I would say here in the simple form here, this is just going to be a playback. If you want to do rigging with bones affecting things, you have to have soft body deformations essentially, right? So this bone affects only these, not polygons, but voxels at certain weights and so on, right? And this is something that's theoretically definitely possible to do. We have a demo.
Not just theoretically, because I have done that like many years ago, but I haven't used bones. I simply used multiple transforms to affect different voxels. So you can do that, but we don't have the particular implementation to actually rig a character, but we can,
with bones,
in some way, even procedurally rig something.
Yeah, but what I say is theoretically is because we have soft body deformations, we just don't have bones causing those transformations. Yeah.
So could you do motion capture then?
Well, so if you have a motion capture skeleton, right, and you rig it to a soft body deformed voxel thing, sure, you could. One thing I see you will be losing that you have here is all those wrinkles and stuff, right, like happening in his face and so on. If you're rigging someone's face, you're back at square one, so to speak, what we were before, with polygons, where you have to now somehow morph or blend in, these things. That might just be something that in a kind of a clever way can be done in conjunction with photogrammetry, where you look at someone's face and make him do all the different types of, expressions possible, and then you tie those into, your rig somehow and so on. This is kind of like down the road. It's going to be, again, in my mind, theoretically possible, but it's not like something that we came out of the gate.
I would say many companies are trying and will be trying to make this kind of solution perfect. Mm-hmm. We can provide them our technology, but I don't think we will be wasting our time with.
Well, in general, well, who knows? But really, the interesting point here is that this used to be a polygonal set, right? They gave us a series of high resolution polygon meshes and the textures, one for each frame of this guy's video, and then we voxelized that. That's unfortunate. We would rather not have it be polygons ever, so that we don't have this polygon soup happening over here, and especially over here. You can see this like kind of crazy stuff that looks like polygons, but they're actually voxels. They're 1 millimeter voxels that came from polygons. It would be better to take photogrammetry data that came out of that algorithm directly, which usually is kind of like a point cloud or some kind of.
This is again a combined effect. It's photogrammetry and it's certain set of parameters of the reconstruction of the geometry that cause that polygon.
You can see issues between his legs here too, like the webbing and so on. So go ahead.
Why turn point clouds into voxels at all? What are the specific advantages? Filling holes and speed? Okay,
in terms of versus
just point cloud, just doing smart, just some smart, fast visualization of point clouds. There are ways to.
If you want to just visualize something you have captured using a scanner, then point clouds are a good solution for actually putting it on screen. Yeah. But if you're going to do more with it, like putting the geometry into a game, into a volumetric video, or work with it in some kind of advanced tool that allows you to work with volumetric geometry, then you probably don't want to do that with point clouds, but you will want to do that with voxels.
Dreams for PS4, what is that? Those are like point clouds, or they can do really kind of cool stuff with them.
Well, there is a nice long talk from Alex Evans. That's his name.
Yeah,
and he explains the rather complex approach to point clouds that don't look like point clouds. Like it's not really point clouds. It has some kind of structure. It's a more complex representation that allows this stylized. That's the
look.
word.
Yeah.
Stylized look. I don't know whether that technology is useful for realistic geometry. I haven't seen anything like that still, but
it's very impressive. Like what they're doing. What I mentioned before when we looked around for anything that is similar to this, Dreams and their technology and what Alex Evans has done is up there. Again, the talk goes into detail. It's available online, but they're doing very impressive things, and I've seen videos of them working in it. You can do large environments and so on. This is cool. Again, but I think it's a stylized look that is okay for a game that is called Dreams, literally. But if you want to do really realistic looking things, I don't know if it's suitable or not. But I would love for it to be. So.
Is it possible to cut through these animations to make holes, and will the animation continue after that?
Not yet, because those are basically separate pieces of data. We're working on. Well, we will show you better examples of animations that are using better compression. But still, we can't really let you edit this geometry the same way you can edit our volumetric format.
Static stuff.
Yeah. So what we will do, I guess, this year already, we will we'll make it possible to basically edit frame by frame as separate data, and the encoder will encode the result on the fly. Like you will still have the original version and the updated version.
Yeah. So this is an interesting one. This is a polygonal kind of diorama, again, that we voxelized, and it's animated, as you can see. So we have all these little cute things going on, but everything is voxels at this point. And this little character, this little cat, and it's similar in the volume video as the previous examples of the heads and so on. But it's a completely different look. This is kind of a cartoony, cute look, and not everything is perfect in here. The voxelizer was done kind of quickly, and so these very thin objects up here kind of disappear, half of them and so on, because we're essentially rasterizing in 3D, right? Like the voxels from geometry that was a little too thin to be captured by this resolution. We can do it at higher resolution.
At this resolution also, but with the different methods.
Yeah.
This method is quite limited.
I can tell you this is super fun in VR to look around. You play with scale, especially. It's really lost on looking at a 2D image like this, but kind of making yourself big and small and experiencing all the different detail of this scene.
Try to lower the LOD.
Lower? Okay. Yeah.
You have a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to ask, when you convert the polygonal models of the point clouds to your voxels, do you feel the insides of the buildings or of the geometry?
That's best. In this case, it's mostly field. The Skeletex research girl was not field, it was just the surface. And it also depends on in what state the mesh, for example, is. Because most meshes that look good in games, for example, don't make any sense or wouldn't make any sense in the real world, because there are all surfaces missing, there are overlaps, there are seams between polygons, and let's say there are cars that have no bottom, and basically if you're not a human, if you're not so intelligent, you can't even reconstruct such an object volumetrically properly. So we have voxelizers that make some guesses and voxelize these objects into a proper volumetric objects. The inside is also of course homogeneous, because there's no information about the inside, but it's filled, so you can then interact with it pretty naturally and carve out some matter and such.
So an interesting. Oh, okay. Yeah.
So this scene and also the previous ones. Well, this one is nice because there is this tram moon. So is all the voxels during the animation with pre-baked lighting, or is it possible to have dynamic lighting computations?
We will show you an example where the geometry is lit more properly, and because we can use shaders, like third-party shaders for polygon geometry, most parts of those shaders, and integrate it into our solution. We can basically use, I can't say all techniques for lighting that are out there, but definitely most of them.
Okay, another question.
Yeah,
You mentioned shaders, I will touch it more later, is that even if you zoom into the image, you reach a level when you see the blocks, you see the
Yes.
cubes.
Totally.
So having all the shaders deployed, and so you are saying that complex light computations are basically possible. Why not using marching cubes to smooth out?
That's one of the many ways how things can be done.
Yeah.
I think there are better ways. Hopefully, likely next year, we will have a solution for geometry in the interactive scenarios, and maybe also next year a solution for these volumetric videos that are compiled and can't be worked with so easily, but still things are doable there. So.
And I think in general the context here is that up till this point, Branislav has been the only one touching code on this for 15 years, right? Right now we're starting an office actually in town, and it makes a lot of sense. He's located here, and there's a lot of very talented people we're finding out in Bratislava. And so our core tech team is going to be here. And so progress on all these fronts that we're talking about, like can we do rigging, can we do upsampling, can we do so on, will actually start happening sooner because it's not all him doing all this work. There is a team that we're building right now as we speak. You know, there's a reason I'm here, Tommy's here right now, and in this point in time, we've set everything up. We're ready to get this kind of team effort going instead of just being poor Brano doing all this. This is something that he put together just like literally minutes before going out the door. Is an asset from a really cool artist online. The colors and materials are obviously not, you know, very appropriate, but it's a test asset. What you're seeing here, some of these demos are going to be, nobody else has seen these yet. We're going to put together a new tech reel in for August, and this is going to be part of it. So you're getting kind of like a exclusive first look at this. I can start editing this actually, so we can go into tools here.
So this shows PBR computation. I literally took something from the internet, put it into GLSL 330 shaders, and that's it. And I can do this with basically any other shader code out there, if it's like
so this
useful.
Yeah, it shows up a lot better in VR honestly because your head is moving all the time. But I just painted some gold on here. It's not super obvious there. Let me see. Okay, here. So what I'm doing is actually, okay, here you can start seeing that PBR shader a little better. And the faceting you're seeing is again from the polygons. It's funny because this was a polygonal model that we voxelized.
Try to carve out something.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that now. And so, well, that was a little much. And it's hollow.
It's hollow there. Go somewhere.
Yeah, higher.
Higher. Yeah.
Totally. So the reason it's hollow is because the model was hollow. We have new versions of this model coming in, but and it looks a little, you know, it looks a little weird on this mechanical model. We have another organic model where it like starts feeling like you're scooping out his brains and stuff, which is interesting, especially in VR when you're doing this with your hands, hand tracking. The volumetric tracking of them is really compelling. It feels like you're scooping. And I can also blob, of course, again. Or can I?
Questions?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. I keep losing.
How long did the conversion take from polygonal model to...
On this one in particular?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I went to sleep, and when I woke up, it was done. And I woke up after 1 hour this night, so that's why he's talking most of the time.
Yeah.
So I think this one was a couple tens of minutes at this resolution. And it's so slow because basically there's a bounding box around it set up, and for each and every voxel in the bounding box, many computations are done using multiple projections, like a few tens of projections from different positions are tested for depth.
And there's some errors because of that too, I'm sure, right?
Yeah, it's not optimized, you know, it's a per voxel solution instead of being per group of voxels and then refine on the most important parts of the geometry, and it's done on a CPU, and this was done on one thread. It's multi-threaded, but this particular model was done on that laptop, which is 6 years old, on a single thread of it. So it's
Yeah, and this is again a work in progress. So there's now for some reason the performance is tanked. I don't know why. It
because
is a work in progress.
For that laptop, not for you.
Yeah. And these are small previews of things we're putting together. So another question?
Is an alpha version of the engine available, or will it be?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you speak up?
Is an alpha version of your engine available, or will
It is not publicly available yet. it's something that we're working towards. Of course, we're putting together that tech team that I mentioned to productize all these prototypes that we have right now and make basically a core SDK that will be at first available to select partners and people we want to work with. Well, to us, internally for sure. But he's asking like, when can I get my hands on it? this is as soon as we can make a product that it will be available widely. We'd love that.
The fastest way how to get your hands on this tag is basically to become part of the team.
Yeah.
Secret paper after a patent is done?
Maybe. I mean, I'm going to SIGGRAPH next month. It's too late to submit this year, I guess, but it is. I'll go back to our presentation before we run out of time, but I have some thoughts and plans for what we're doing with that format, the universal format that all this is going to be in. Already is in, but it's going to be more matured. And we're tentatively planning on making it an open format completely. So at some point, people are going to have no hesitation of converting their data, whether it's polygonal or any kind of 3D data into this format, because it's going to be very good, of course, but also because it's going to be completely open. And this is another preview. This is obviously a crocodile. It's a video of a crocodile, and this has some things missing, like an environment, but also some detail. Yeah, there's a displacement map that's not applied yet.
Yeah.
In the voxelization.
This was voxelized from a not really high poly model, but that high poly model had a not really high poly model had a displacement map.
Yeah.
It wasn't used in this case. Also, there are some missing pieces of geometry. But what we got is a 5 meters long crocodile voxelized at 2 millimeter detail, and basically this is a voxel volumetric video stream, like MPEG in 2D, but this is in 3D. And if you pause it and go very close to it,
yeah, sure. Pausing. Boom. Yeah,
or just slow it down really,
okay, sure.
really much, and
like a lot,
and like this, and go close to it. Now that it returns from the, you can see the voxels there, like how small they are.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about voxels is that the brain understands them as noise, basically, especially when that thing is moving at a normal speed. So while we don't even have a sub-millimeter detail here, the brain doesn't care. You can go close to it when the playback is played at normal speed, and it's all fine. It's similar like with those human faces. The brain feels like that's a real human. The noise doesn't really matter, unlike in CG geometries where the brain detects instantly that that's the uncanny valley problem.
Jesus, I lost him.
If you point really much down, and go
there
up.
he is. There we go. Yeah. So what Branislav is saying is that and you saw that with the faces and so on. There's not a lot of situations where you're going to be like at kissing distance with that guy, right? Like in VR especially, unless it's a kissing simulator. I mean, possible, right? But this crocodile too, I have to get super close to him before I even start getting bothered by any kind of look of a blockiness or voxels. At this point I don't see it at this screen. I don't know what you see on the bigger screen.
If you lower the LOD, they'll see that it's not a typical rigged animation, but it's really voxels being updated.
Yeah. So it's a video, right? Like it's a volumetric video. Every frame is being resampled. So it's different from the wheels on that car, that we showed it in the beginning. And it's quite interesting. You get this, I can do the Minecraft version of this crocodile. But this is a very interesting point for our argument that this is the way forward in terms of scale and simulation. Because often, and Tommy spoke about foveated rendering before, right? Like in VR especially. If you're looking at this crocodile, but there's another crocodile on the horizon, you don't care about 2 millimeter voxels on that crocodile on the horizon. You probably are okay if there's 4 voxels representing that to you in the geometry of your view. And so if there's a simulation where in the cloud there's a bunch of crocodiles in different distances from you, and you're only close to one of them, what you only need to send to that user that is looking at that one crocodile is high resolution of that crocodile. It doesn't even have to be the whole crocodile. It could be you're looking at only the face, so to speak, and you see how half the crocodile is at a higher LOD and the half is a lower. This is a huge deal. This is something that's very hard to do with polygons, and it's trivial, so to speak.
Yeah, not sure the foveated rendering is on here.
No, it's not.
Because it's two
But
effects.
it's a distance, yeah.
It's the LOD is based on distance or some other property of the geometry, and based on where the user is looking with his foveal area. And you can not only render based on these parameters, but also process the geometry based on let's say, what's the spot the user is looking at.
So what we get as a result is foveated not only rendering of the output, but you're getting foveated geometry, which is you're looking at a certain part of the crocodile, like you get really close to its nose, and you only really need to see that nose in high resolution, especially in VR, where the rest of your brain is not really picking up that resolution. What's that?
There is foveated rendering here. Maybe we can show it more.
Fovea, yeah.
Fovea, yeah.
What mode on?
On.
Circular. Okay, well, I don't know if it's going to be apparent.
Yeah, make the resolution a bit higher because it's.
Yeah, we got to move on with the presentation, but we can try to get this. I think you get the idea, though. Yeah. So I'm looking at.
It's not working perfectly,
Yeah.
but it's working.
So in theory, especially, and in this we expect, this data set has more to it. Like there's a whole environment that we're working on. You can show maybe on your laptop later that it was rendering a second ago.
Yeah.
Not now, but later. So having this in VR, where this crocodile is walking up to you and suddenly kind of lunging towards you, is going to be quite powerful. These kind of scare moments in VR. Tommy is very good at them with his games or at prototypes. Anyway, so before we run out of time, these are kind of like some quick demos. I want to go back to what we were talking about here a second ago. Oops. And anyway, challenges. So really the way forward.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
somebody had a question. You.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
It took a lot of time to load that video. How big is the file with the
It's
video?
big. It's big.
It's 5 gigs, I think.
Yeah.
The compression is super low, and you can see it on that the voxels are being updated every frame, which is not necessary because basically any decent video codec has to be based on temporal coherency of the data, and once that's in place, the footprint drops by 85 to 98%, depending on how strong the compression is. So we're foreseeing the same here because the data is kind of friendly towards this kind of compressions.
But the point is that this.
How much
Yeah, go
do you
ahead.
think it could be compressed? 5 gig is a
Right.
really big chunk of data.
Yeah,
I think to
20
be
megs maybe.
this practical,
Is it 20 megs?
Yeah,
that would be
I
practical.
saw the numbers.
Okay. Wow.
No, the thing is, it's hard to get there, not because of the compression. It's super easy to come up with a compression method once you know the data. The real problem is to implement it. So I know how, for 10 years, I know how to do things how to make things really great or perfect almost. But I was so bandwidth limited that I have only implemented like 5% of the things I wanted. And it's the same with compression. In order to make a great video encoder, you have to spend basically at least a year or years to make it work. To make it work in such a way that it won't take like 2 or 3 days to encode a single video, right? So it's not only an implementation of a good codec, it's also a fast implementation of that codec, and this takes time. So that's the problem. Is the implementation is not the compression as such. That's easy to do.
You guys remember back in the day, like video was when it went before like good MPEG-4 and all these compressions, they were super big, right? Like it was ridiculous. And then people worked on it for a while because they saw this was the way forward with how to transmit images, moving images over the internet and so on. And people put but you have to have the fundamental paradigm correct before you can go there. Like Microsoft is doing pretty interesting things with trying to do temporal coherency compression on meshes. So they have like their holographic capture stuff. I don't want to get too deep into it, but they're doing compression on meshes by having the vertices kind of be in the same spot even when they're animating, and then they do a new keyframe and they kind of jump and so on. And they compress a lot that way, but they're really dealing with this crazy complexity of having a mesh and a texture and the mapping between the two, and there's issues with fingers getting lost and so on.
In this sense, our data is just the texture, a volumetric texture, but it's a texture, and it makes things much simpler because you don't have to.
You don't have to be as clever, honestly, right?
Yeah. Meshes really introduce lots of complexity into basically anything you want to achieve. Yeah. Because meshes are so different from the real thing. Like our world is not made of meshes, right? Our world is made of volumetric material. So if we want to be really efficient at coming up with great solutions for all kinds of issues, it's good if we work with a representation that actually works in ways similar like the real world.
Yeah. Sorry.
I actually think this makes a lot of sense for captured video or data, 3D world, whatever, but you lose interactivity, and especially since you compress it with this algorithm that even takes a long time. But what if you want to make interactive worlds, like you want to interact with me and you cannot pre-compute it, so therefore you need this colorful animation and whatever.
And that's still a possibility, like it's still in the cards, right?
I would say there is a long pipeline from the source data, which can be point clouds or polygons or whatever, up until the screen, right? And the volumetric video we are showing, that's the very last part of the pipeline. But before that, we have all the benefits of geometry we can interact with. So it depends on the actual use case, what kind of techniques we will use. So this volumetric video isn't interactive, but if somebody gives us a rigged character that where the texture came from photogrammetry, we will have the same benefits of these mesh-based solutions have. Like we're not losing anything, but we have some additional.
It's just Branislav hasn't invested the time in making that rig implementation because it's a lot of work and it's a whole other branch kind of, and it's something we want. This is the question we get from everyone: can we do rig characters? Because you guys get that's where interactivity comes from. So that's actually very, very much in line with what I'm about to talk to next here, is that the way forward out of this local maximum that we're kind of stuck in our opinion, is that you have to take a step back. You have to take a step out of the local maximum to then get the full potential. So
it's not our opinion only. Like
it doesn't. I don't want to state facts necessarily. But
we are seeing this shift in thinking. It's happening for at least.
Right. We're not alone in thinking this way. Let's put it that way. So you really have to, in this step back, you have to sacrifice some rendering quality results in the short term, or other features like rigging, things that are super mature. Like there's these really cool tools that people have thought about for a long time, decades, in this one way of doing things. But you have to take a step back from that and honestly throw away some of these things because they're built around complexity to handle complexity that doesn't exist anymore, or doesn't have to exist anymore. So you have to take that step back, and some of these demos we show you they don't look better than some 3D render stuff like NVIDIA's latest tech demos. Like they look definitely better. They have cooler ray tracing, or they have some other implementations that shaders and so on. And this is what we're talking about. You have to take a step back before you can build up again and then have a higher potential, that global maximum instead. And really, I make the case that the market really cares about this dynamic simulation. Minecraft showed that. It looks like ass, like graphics 0, right? But it has something that the market really wanted, and it showed in the sales numbers of it. So we will get the rendering quality back up to the level it's at now soon enough, because shaders and global illumination and ray tracing all play nice with this form of data. It just needs a lot of people to work on the implementations for it, and more than one guy, So I have a couple of subtopics here. Making the transition as smooth as possible is important. For us, making it seamless as possible to voxelize existing polygonal assets, so you can take existing stuff that you have, if you have a half-built game or something, to turn it into voxels easily, or using existing toolchains that you're very comfortable with and you don't want to abandon. You can still do that and then voxelize it at the end. And that's what we're doing with all these sample data that we're getting from artists and so on. It's usually polygonal data. You're still retaining all the fidelity though. We're not really we're asking people to give us the craziest, highest resolution meshes they have that they never can even do in you know, they could never use in a real-time simulation, but they start with that and then they, you know, decimate. But we want the highest resolution because we can retain all that fidelity. And also, the reduced asset complexity in general, after you've voxelized, it means that there's less time for you to relearn all these tools because the tools won't have to be as complex. You know, there's going to take time to make all the tool chains and so on be capable, but they won't have to be as capable or as complex again because the data itself is not that complex. So voxels can also be easily blended with polygonal rendering. Like we could have polygons rendering and the voxels in the depth buffer and have them coexist next to each other. And if this is a way forward for some big studios that don't want to kind of take the full plunge right away, but maybe render faces or heads in voxels or something like that, then this is definitely possible. Although that hybrid solution they're probably going to find is not great either because you're combining the worst of both worlds in some ways also. You still have those polygon limits and so on. We predict that people will, once they take the dip of their toe, they want to jump in fully pretty soon after that. This is a pretty provocative slide, so don't kill me. But you know, I feel that disruption happens in industries all the time. There's people who invested a lot of time and a lot of money and just effort into learning the very complex tools that handle the complexity of things, right? The status quo right now. And some of them won't be happy to see things fundamentally change, you know, and there'll be resistance there. This happened in every industry many, many times. I mean, I can give so many examples of phone operators used to manually connect things. I've done photography and what happened when photography went from analog film to digital. You know, there were a lot of people who were not happy with that because now all these, or kids with phones, you know, are competing with, you know, professional photographers now because technology has disrupted it. Cab drivers being disrupted by Uber and so on. This temporary discomfort is far outweighed by long-term overall gains for everyone involved. True professionals will suck it up and adapt and stay on top of their game. So deal with it. Catching up with current levels of tech maturity, which is what we talked about briefly, existing hardware and all these techniques and simulation and workflows and just the ways of thinking in the polygonal way and the current way have decades of iteration behind them, like multiple entire industries, not just games industry, but CGI industry and like medical imaging and all these different areas that use 3D graphics. It'll take time to achieve the same level, but not as much time because this new way of doing things is much less complex. So you don't have to be as clever with your decimation or LOD generating algorithms or dealing with clever texture compressions and so on, and linking them and making sure there's no weirdness going on there. So the good news is that it's not going to take as much time to catch up. So that's kind of the challenges of and taking a step back. Why do we do all this? Like, what's the reward in the end? This is where we see this going ideally. Again, it's not necessarily because we're trying to make it happen sooner than later. We see this as inevitable. So these are three things that we ideally see will happen, where there's going to be thin clients for viewing this voxel data pretty much everywhere, like in web browsers even, on mobile phones, on mobile VR, AR devices like Tommy was talking about, on desktop devices or in living room kind of entertainment systems. In the future, there's going to be maybe some kind of mainstream volumetric projection display or stuff you see in Blade Runner, you know, where you have advertising that is, you can see from any angle and they reach out and touch you and stuff. These are going to be thin clients because they're streaming, because of all these benefits that voxels and volumetric sample geometry can offer. You can stream this data from a cloud into these, you know, mobile phones or whatever, and you stream only the information that you want the user to see, or the user is actually viewing in that larger simulation. And so this is a super powerful thing.
Yeah, I would say streaming is a problem because of the lags, right? And all kinds of issues that occur on the network. What this solution provides to such a system is the enormous flexibility in levels of details. And that's a huge benefit because it makes things simple. So whatever the system deals with, whatever issues on the network or dips in performance on the target machines, there is a good chance that this flexibility in LODs will mitigate those issues much better than with other solutions.
And also, I mean, Carmack talks about, and he's worked a lot on this with the mobile VR situation where you have data streamed, video data, like two-dimensional video data streamed to a mobile headset, and you can't stream it fast enough, so you're actually streaming a bigger field of view, so that the head tracking, which has to be happening very quickly, a very quick iteration loop, otherwise you get super nauseous, right? Like if it's laggy in any way. So you're streaming a bigger field so that locally it can happen very quickly. And if you turn your head very quickly, it might be black over there because that hasn't streamed in yet. That concept can also be expanded to this, where you're streaming in the three-dimensional volumetric data around you that is closest to you or that you're looking at, and maybe a little bit more, so that the user can move around their head without lag and so on. And when they do move their head, you stream in what needs to be there, but you're solving this lag issue.
So basically, you can have pretty much almost any latencies. The rendering will happen on those 90 FPS.
Yeah.
That's the power of volumetric video.
Yeah.
So whatever is happening on the server side, when it's turned into voxels and sent to the end user, that's the solution for basically lags.
Yeah.
Similar issues.
So this we touched on before, where we see this going to an open standard, like, all 3D and 4D data, so video as well, volume video, ideally should be the same format. It should be this super universal format that's interchangeable between all these different applications. So, let's say you saw a really cool volumetric video a few years from now, and you saw a set piece, like a piece of a building or even a whole square in a city, and you wanted to make a game, and you needed some art, to make this Spider-Man game, right? And you're like, oh, if the licensing and rights are clear, I can actually grab that and put it in my game without any conversion, without any even having to worry about what the resolution differences might be and so on. It's all kind of handled. You might have seen in our demos, like some assets were higher resolution voxels than others, and they can coexist next to each other, no problem. And there's so many powerful things that cascade from this, where you could have already today in our format, Branislav was prescient enough to know that he can't predict what people will want to store with each voxel, so he made it very flexible. So you can store stuff that you care about, like maybe authorship. So whoever built that city block or captured it with photogrammetry is stored in all those voxels, like it might be a blockchain code or something, and then if you use that in your game and then you sell your game for money, that initial person could actually get a cut based on this calculation of what was used in there, like the actual stuff. This is, again, kind of dreaming about the future, but it's theoretically very possible to do this kind of thing. And having this universal format is the foundation of that happening.
Yeah, it's doable quite easily. That's the thing here. Yeah. Like you can come up with pretty much any solution where you need to have authorship somehow encoded into geometry, and the system will handle it. And
just like Adobe and the PDF format, initially that was a proprietary format to deal with documents of any kind that could be read by any computer and come from any source. They eventually, or very quickly, decided to make it an open standard, and now today it's a completely royalty-free open standard. It's ISO kind of standardized, and it's the thing that everyone exchanges documents with. This is something we would like to see for universal format like this. Having it be streamable, highly compressible, and flexible enough to hold whatever metadata, like I mentioned before, people want, materials, authorship, whatever you want really, is important for this format. So this is really the ultimate vision, and this is kind of the end of our talk, so if you're falling asleep, try to hang on for another minute. But it's really, this is the holy grail. This is what we would love for this vision to go towards. Whether it's us doing it or someone else, we would love this to be the result, because volumetric computing, you call it spatial computing, you call it visual computing, like Tommy. I mean, these are all different names for the same thing, basically, but will be a very big democratizing step for humanity. Like, just like smartphones, I don't know if you saw your grandma started actually using a smartphone because it's very intuitive to be pressing things with your finger instead of like a million buttons on the earlier phones. This is a big step. The iPhone was a huge kind of democratizing, like not super technical people all of a sudden could use smartphones. And that opened up a whole market, you know, for Tommy to make games for and so on. This will be another kind of huge step where with VR, for example, or AR, when they become very elegant devices, which they are not today, and you have hand tracking and you have head tracking, which are super intuitive things that we learn as babies. Literally, when babies like are playing with their toys and stuff, they're learning how to use their hands and grab things in volume and put them in their mouth and look at them and all these stuff that babies do. Everyone has learned this, and it's an intuitive thing. And if we can make computers kind of adapt to that, this is a very kind of empowering thing. Immersive virtual worlds enabled by this new paradigm. Again, it's super hard to just do a sandbox, like a literal sandbox with the current paradigm. Like you can do a height map, right? And you can kind of let people, but as soon as you let people do like a cave, this is really hard to do. And if it's gonna simulate how there's structural integrity and all this stuff in the sand as kind of an analogy for a larger world, this is extremely hard to do with the current way of doing things. We have to do this switch that we've been talking about for a couple hours now. And if you could even make it so that anyone in the world who has one of these cheaper devices, which are still expensive for a lot of people, but they're getting cheaper and cheaper. Like Oculus's latest headset is $200, which is quite affordable. And it'll only get cheaper and better at the same time. Anyone with one of those that can connect to a common simulation, just like these sci-fi wet dreams that we've seen in movies and so on. I mean, this is kind of what everyone, the Matrix and the metaverse and so on. Once that can happen, and anyone can connect and only get the data streamed to them that they need to see and interact with it, this is a huge thing. And people, not just a few people, but millions of people will work and they will play. This is Ready Player One. And they'll learn in these virtual worlds. And it'll be available to anyone who has a good internet connection, decent internet connection, which is becoming very available, and one of these devices. So that's kind of our talk. So we have a few more minutes, I think.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add, Ron?
Oh, I guess no. But feel free to ask any questions.
Yeah. Any other questions on any of this stuff? Wow.
How much memory does it take? I mean, perhaps
64 bit.
I mean, the
You don't need more than
For
64K.
example, the
Yeah.
crocodile. How much memory does it
Yeah. I
use
can-
up in the computer?
Yeah. Let's look at that. So you know.
Depends on what state the data is. The data set was like 5.2 gigs, I think, on the disk.
We can look at it.
So that's the 2 millimeter voxel model.
You can see it growing right now. What do you think it's going to land
Because
on?
this solution totally unpacks the whole data set.
Yeah, it's
So-
not streaming it really at all.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
streaming. Well,
Yeah.
it can, but
But it's not.
it
So-
would be done in the same thread.
Mhm.
So
Oh,
the
that'd be nice.
rendering performance would be kind of crappy.
So now I know why you wanted us to buy more RAM over
Yeah.
the weekend.
Yeah, because I didn't know how big they would
Yeah,
be
it's
after,
great. Totally.
after that
Yeah.
generation.
So what he's doing is a naive implementation, right? Like
Yeah.
he's making it work first, and then he makes it clear, and then we optimize, right? So this is not doing premature optimization. It works, and we get a result, and we'll get interactive results out of it, which is really the working part. And then you optimize after that, and you have a series of things that you can do here to make this a lot more optimized. You can stream it to begin with, if you have multiple threads feeding the first thread, so to speak, right?
Yeah, and better compression. Like, it is compressed, but it's most trivial
lowest
thing
hanging
you can,
fruit. Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
come up with.
So what did it end up on? Yeah, 22 gigs. That's pretty hefty.
Yeah.
So, but again, like I think that's again, this is the kind of unlimited spec machine that would be in the cloud, right? Running the simulation, and what gets sent to a viewer of this ultimately, if we can do the streaming right, if we can do the compression right, will be much lighter, of course, to that same client. And yeah, I mean, I can only say we're talking to very interesting companies right now. Very large companies, very interesting companies who are very interested in what we're doing. They're reaching out to us, and it's because they are thinking along the similar lines, and they have a lot of compute power in the cloud, you know, that they want to use. So.
Have you maybe talked to Autoy? They have a light field.
Yeah,
right?
we haven't talked to them directly. We're very familiar with their stuff, and Carmack loves their stuff, right? Like light fields in general and so on. And he says if you squint just the right way, you can kind of like get. I forget the Autoy's founder. What's the crazy name? Yeah, Urbach. Yeah, Jules. Yeah. Genius guy, clearly, and it works really hard. I mean, you can see that. Too much. It's like the circles under his eyes. He can wear with pride, you know, as a badge of honor. But I mean, he's doing really interesting stuff. I think from my thinking, there's problems with light fields in general that they're hard to simulate with. They don't scale very well in a lot of ways.
Yeah, the scalability is a huge issue.
Yeah.
Because we have geometry, and
like actual geometry,
and there are known solutions that can lead geometry in a realistic way. So we don't really have to switch to something like light fields and make requirements skyrocket into hundreds to tens of thousands, like literally terabytes to petabytes, in order to encode some kind of video.
Yeah.
And still, that solution wouldn't scale to in size, basically, because if it's encoded for, let's say, this space for your head movement, then you can't stand up and walk around the object or the scene you want to see if it's a light field based solution. But because we have geometry, we can scale into any size. We don't have any issue with higher resolution of the displays in headsets, because the geometry is still there. It's the same geometry, and the resolution comes from the actual rendering process, not just the geometry. But with light fields, it's kind of hard to think of like how that would work and scale in size and resolution and all that stuff.
And okay, this is comparison to light fields, and what about a comparison to Neuralize from AtomView? I mean, AtomView from Neuralize. Is there competition, or?
It looks like they are doing point clouds, and I tend to say that from these three representations, point clouds and polygons as vector representations and voxels as non-vector representations, point clouds are the worst because they don't have any benefit of the kind of data like a texture, whether it's two-dimensional, simply structured data. So point clouds are heavy, and they don't provide you much functionality. Like you have to come up with something else than just a point cloud to actually be able to do something with that geometry. So maybe you can render a point cloud quite well as long as you're far from it, or you make the points like bigger on screen, and you view the point cloud from a certain angle. But if you want to work with volumetric geometry because of simulation or some kind of interaction, and you want to fill the space with points, which are vector values basically, you will have huge problems because you can't compress such kind of data really easily, and you have to also include the vector components.
You don't know this yet, but I got an email from the Neuralize guys yesterday. They're doing their closed beta or open beta. I signed up for it, so they basically just confirmed that I had to confirm that I really wanted it still, and so I'm looking forward to checking it out. What I've seen of them, they make beautiful things happen on the screen, and that is not even half the battle. It's the simulation and this kind of thing. If you want to do simulation, I mean, what they're doing might solve be good solutions for a lot of things, right? Like where you really want to only visualize large kind of clouds or something like that. But if you want to simulate like those cars and do games and so on, this is going to be really hard. This is another kind of random data set we got. It's a real CT scan animation, of course. You see a lot of noise going on in here. It's kind of cool to see the noise actually because, and it's somewhat low resolution honestly. It's 512 by 512 by 512. We wish the machine outputted more than that. It did not, so we got what we have here. But we can play this back, you know, a very high frame rate, and even with all this noise. And it's kind of neat to see this analog-looking noise in what is obviously not analog, but this is, you can still see that the heart, which is very enlarged, this is someone's poor condition, but even through the noise, you can kind of see what's going on. This in VR is really, really frightening, honestly. You're like in here, moving around, you get all that volumetric depth going on. It's pretty cool, but we wish the resolution was higher. So I think that's kind of the time we had. We can do a couple of demos up here, maybe fire up the VR and have some people look at it, and everyone else can look at the screen. I can't have that up on here at the same time. I ran out of HDMI ports for that. So maybe we set up the VR for a minute or two, and you guys are welcome to try it out.
Little Tokyo maybe?
Yeah, that'd be a good one. So thanks for coming again, guys. This is really cool. We are starting a company here, so you know we think this is a really strong talent pool in general. You know, and it makes a lot of sense for us because Ronald's here. So if this is something that's interesting for you guys to work on, please talk to us also about that. It's something. Hey, all right, Nazi, you joined us. Cool. So yeah. Please feel free to talk to us. We have cards up here, and we can be in touch via email. So again, thanks a lot, guys.